All right, world history. Here we are on finishing 17.1. Hopefully, you were able to finish 17.1 and 2 activities. And now we're going to look at the rest of this section, and we're covering up through about 1821, as well as looking at the Western Hemisphere, the New World, and the events that happen over many decades in South America. So again, we're looking largely at Europe in the 19th century. And here we're talking about the reaction to the Napoleonic era and the French Revolution. Sometimes we use these terms reaction and revolution. Reaction is kind of like trying to pull back, and revolution is so anyway, reaction is often kind of more of a hyper conservative, whereas revolution is kind of a hyper liberal moving forward in a new direction. So here's where we left off yesterday, and this was the agreement at the Congress of Vienna. And so now we're going to see how that worked out for the next couple of years in the early 19th century. So we're at the top of page 368. So they formed this quadruple alliance between these countries that had defeated Napoleon. So this grand alliance, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, and remember, three of these are still absolutist states. And so they're not real interested in the Napoleonic reforms and the revolution that happened. So they restore the monarchy in France, and so they allow France to join after a couple of years. So what were they hoping to suppress? It says it here on page 368. So again, they're trying to stave off these changes that have been happening over the last 20 to 30 years in France particularly, and through Napoleon throughout the rest of Europe. Just at one note here, liberalism here doesn't mean necessarily what we mean by it today. Liberalism then was promotion of liberty, again, particularly for the non-noble classes. If you think of those three estates in France, for that third estate. So that's what we mean by liberalism here. It doesn't mean what we mean by it today. So this becomes known as the Concert of Europe. So first we're dealing with things in Southern Europe, and we see the repetition of these terms: liberty, equality, fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And again, this concert is attempting to suppress this and kind of return things to the status quo ante, which means the way things were before. So they reinstate not only the monarchy in France, but they reinstate the monarchy in Spain. What did he first do here in the middle of page 368? As you can see, he's not really interested in promoting these new modern Enlightenment ideas. But the people aren't going to go for that, so they want the Constitution that they had written restored, and because the military is turning against him, he has to accede to these demands. And this alarms this Congress, this concert, but it causes people in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and again, if you look at the map, we're talking about southern Italy here, okay, the island of Sicily, and then the boot part of Italy, they're also beginning an uprising. And again, this doesn't make the people in Prussia and Russia happy because they figure if it can happen there, it can happen here as well. So, what's the response of the concert of Europe to Italy and Spain and what's happening there? So, now there's issues happening in the New World. Um, so, these colonies, the countries today that we know as Colombia, Peru, they were still Spanish colonies at this time. And they are also pressing for independence. So, what does the Congress decide to do? Well, just as they did in Italy and Spain, they attempt to suppress. However, you can see the quote here at the bottom of page 368. If the New World ever becomes entirely Republican, which again means elected representatives not being ruled by family dynasties or bloodlines, the monarchies of the old world will perish. It's kind of similar to what King James said, no bishop, no king. He wants a particular hierarchical church government to support a hierarchical civil government. However, not everybody was interested in this. Why was Britain, according to page 369, happy with the Spanish colonies' independence? And as you discuss that here, it just kind of reminds you that efforts at international government rarely succeed. There may be some common interests, but usually the national interest will win out. So James President Monroe warned the European nations not to get involved in the Western Hemisphere. So this became known. This became known as the Monroe Doctrine. And so, even though the United States could not enforce it, the British Navy, who were interested in maintaining their trade with South America, they end up sort of de facto allying with the United States on this. So there's weaknesses because there's not uniformity in how they're pursuing this policy of suppressing, and also these countries are not staying together. Okay, then as today, national interest superseded what? And you can see this happening, in the League of Nations and the United Nations. Nations will have certain interests in common, but when it comes right down to it, the national interest will virtually always supersede the international effort. So, it's as true today as it was 200 years ago. Now, as we look at this map here, this is kind of surveying what the rest of the chapter is going to talk about. Today, we're only talking about the ones in the south: Spain, Italy, and Greece. It's not till later that we're going to end up talking about France and the big 1848 revolution that's going to happen throughout Europe. So Greece is under the Ottoman Empire. So they rebel against the Ottoman Empire. And again, you might think, well, these absolute monarchies, we got to help restore order there. Well, see, here's a case of that's a Muslim empire. They're not necessarily interested in propping up a Muslim empire. So they actually come to the aid of the Greeks They are fellow Europeans. They do share in the Christian heritage, even though it's Eastern Orthodoxy, as opposed to, which of course Russia would also be part of. So it's a little bit different situation, but again, it kind of exposes the inconsistencies of what this concept of Europe is about. So they end up fighting against the Turks. The Treaty of Adrianople um, recognizes Greece's independence again. So again, the major powers of Europe supported the cause of revolution that they opposed at home. So it's like, what is it? What's the right way to go about this? So there seems to be increasing hypocrisy that Congress supports revolution as long as it is not within their own borders. All right, now we're going to turn to the New World. We've already talked about them a little bit. The Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And so we're talking about Latin America. So look at the explanation here. What is Latin America and how big is it? Here in page 370. So if you look here on the map on page 371, essentially we're talking about everything that is south of the United States. And I guess we could say except for the Caribbean. That's kind of treated separately because there's a lot of British colonies there as opposed to Spanish and Portuguese. Okay. Now, again, who had colonized this region back in the 1500s when we looked at chapter, I don't know, what was it, 12 or 13? So it was the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, there's a big difference here, and that's part of the reason why the fight for independence is going to be different as well. The English colonies had, going all the way back to the Mayflower Compact, had been largely left alone. Again, Britain was too involved with fighting other European powers, and also their own internal conflicts, right? Throughout the 17th century, there's a civil war that's going on. So they leave the Americans alone, whereas the Latin American colonies were always being heavily ruled by Spain and Portugal. There's a much stronger tether. So the peninsulares, and again, that would be referring to the Iberian Peninsula, right, the homeland of Spain. So they're born in Spain, these wealthy noblemen, and they come over here to rule. And did they serve the people or themselves? As you read about the peninsulares here on page 370. Well, like so many rulers that we've seen, they're just there to kind of get rich, and they're kind of robbing the people. They're not seeking to better them. So this angered the Criollas, the Spaniards that are born over there in the colonies, as well as the rest of the people. The Indians, remember, this is the land of the Incas and the Aztecs, right? And they're not all completely killed when the Spaniards get there. I mean, many of them are killed, but they're still there, just as there's Native Americans in the United States, despite the fact that many of them were killed. The mestizos, there was those who there was intermarrying, but also there was African slave trade. So there's Black Hispanics who were especially held in low esteem. So there's tensions going on here, but again, there's growing hostility toward the motherland of Spain. How was Napoleon at the bottom of page 370 with these colonial rebellions? Well, if they didn't like the peninsulares ruling over them, they certainly don't want a Frenchman. They don't want Napoleon's brother ruling over them. And so there's even more desire for independence. So you have these two men, Simon Bolivar and Jose de San Martin, and they seek to liberate New Spain to be their own countries. So Bolivar, you can see the map here on page 371. He's coming from what would be Venezuela and marching south through what we call Ecuador and into Peru. Whereas San Martin, with the backing of Argentina that already was independent, he comes up from the south into Chile and Peru. And they do this rather quickly. Um, again, Spain is not as powerful as they had been, so they don't necessarily have the forces to be able to quell anything like the British tried to do against the American colonies. Now, Portugal here, and by the way, you can see the pictures there of Simon Bolivar and Jose. We'll see another picture of him. Top of page 371, we see that Portugal is a different situation. So look here, how did the King of Portugal end up actually reigning in Brazil? Well, again, Napoleon is involved in this indirectly. So after reigning there for a few years, he goes back and leaves his son, Dom Pedro. Dom Pedro decides he doesn't necessarily want to be a loyal son. And so he decides to declare Brazil independent, and he, makes himself king, essentially, of this new area. And I think because he already is sort of a royal, he is largely accepted during his time and his son's time. But then later on, as we go down several years, what happens to Brazil? Well, they decide to, again, like these other places, declare themselves a republic, but it doesn't last very long. The birth of liberty in Latin America and gained independence from Spain tended to follow a pattern. And Mexico is an example of this. The nation's new leaders fought among themselves until military leaders, caudillos, stepped in. And this is just a common South American story that continues even up until the present day, where there are not strong institutions of republican government like you see in the United States, even before it becomes a separate country. And so it's again, it's this notion of might makes right. Whoever's got the guns tends to get the power, and they don't tend to rule for the benefit of the people, but for the benefit of themselves largely. Just all kinds of corruption. You see it in Africa as well. We'll talk about that later. So Porfirio Diaz, he promises to rule as a good Republican, but again, he becomes a dictator, and dictators don't like to be elected out of office, so they tend to cancel elections. So he rules for 30 years. And then this other guy. So what were some of the bad things that Diaz did? Look here next to your map where it says Mexico on page 371. So this was not a pleasant time. It's almost like being back under the conquistadors in some ways. So they begin to resist. There's a guy who raises up and tries to run against him for an election in the early 20th century. And what happens? What does Diaz do to him? Typical, if you're in power, you don't like somebody speaking against you. Again, if you're not committed to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, being willing to be criticized publicly. We're seeing some of that happen even today in our own country, where, if you have questions about last fall's election, you're being accused of disinformation, and you're being shut down, you're being kicked off of social media. It's not exactly the same, but some of the impulses there are similar. So the people revolt and they elect Madero president. However, more disputing, again, not having a clear system of how things are to be governed, not having a clear constitution that sets out checks and balances. And so again, whoever has the most power, whoever is able to organize the most effective militia, often ends up taking over. So here is Bolivar and Martin, and again, there's pictures of them on page 370 and 371 in your book. There's Dom Pedro, and he becomes the emperor of Brazil. So again, we see Bolivar and San Martin, and that these end up becoming separate companies. Of course, Gran Colombia is going to split up into further countries later on. Guianas are at the top of South America. You know, they're separate countries today, but they were like a Dutch colony, a French colony, and an English colony, I believe. Guyana, Suriname. Um, so, and then Brazil, you can see Rio de Janeiro was the capital there for the King of Portugal. And I believe it's still the capital of Brazil today. So what's the common thread through Latin America? Again, you got to be careful about generalizations here, but this is largely what happens. We're here on page 372. So what type of government did they seek to establish? And why were they usually so unsuccessful? Again, they sought to establish republics, but again, not having those strong principles, strong traditions, um, strong institutions that are able to maintain Republican and Democratic, they end up getting overrun and it just becomes these tiny dictatorships. They experienced frequent changes in government as one military dictator was overthrown and another took his place. Again, we've talked about this before, not having a clear plan of succession that's either based on a dynastic bloodline or that's based on, you've got a constitution that says you can only be in power for 4 years or 6 years or 8 years, like our constitution does. And then there has to be an election of a new officer. Okay. If you don't have that, then guys tend to stay in as long as they're alive, as long as they can keep power. Um, that's why a guy like Putin, even though there's a so-called election in Russia, he's been in power for 20 years or not longer. Xi Jinping, was declared um, whatever president for life a few years ago, and that tends to be the way it is if you don't have a strong constitutional system. Now, the other problem is the fact that these guys at the top, they like their money and they want to keep their money. So there's no middle class that encourages people to rise from the bottom and seek to rise to the top. Again, we've talked about how Roman Catholicism, because it is so hierarchical, tends to promote hierarchical governments as well. Is not necessarily interested in republicanism or democracy. Okay, now that's somewhat changed because that's the way the world has gone and Rome has adapted. But at least in this time period, they're used to the feudalist kind of model. Remember, in France, they're called the First Estate. And so, whereas the Protestantism in the American colonies allowed for more independent thinking, not as reliance on priestcraft, if you want to put it that way, and royalty. So now because there's not a real understanding of the gospel and how that heals divisions between people. There's a lot of ethnic tension between, the slaves that have been brought over, the native people, the Indians, the Europeans. So there's lots of issues there. And again, instead of forming a united South America, a genuine new Spain with different states, they choose to be different countries. And so you could sort of say that there's tribal or national, keeps them weak. There's also the fact that you don't really have an industrial revolution happen down there the way you're going to in Europe and in the United States. So Latin America has virtually no industry. They have resources, but they're not able to, they also don't have that Protestant work ethic that we talked about with the United States that really drives people to excel and to achieve and to take dominion over the creation. The Roman Catholicism down there is often mixed with some of the paganism that was already there, and so it doesn't encourage a strong work ethic. So the economy only has a few products, so there's not the ability for that diversity that allows for lots of different economic activity to take place and to provide growth. Another problem is that even though they declare independence from Europe, the European nations are still very much involved. Remember, Europe has a lot of the power throughout this century, and they're gonna exercise that power, whether it's in Africa, as we'll see a little bit later, or continuing to in South America. And so the United States, in an effort to kind of maintain that Monroe Doctrine, ends up becoming much more involved. And so that's kind of more the story of the 20th century and the late 19th century. So as we think about finishing up this section, I've got a few more things to cover for you, but I would like you to answer the questions here for the section review, questions 1 to 9. And yeah. So what are things you need to know from section 1 for your test later on? Well, you got to know about Castlereagh, Alexander I of Russia, von Metternich of Austria, de Talleyrand of France, Simon Bolivar, Spanish colonies, Jose de San Martin, Dom Pedro of Portugal, of Brazil. What was the Congress of Vienna? What was the Quadruple Alliance that eventually became the Quintuple Alliance? What was the Monroe Doctrine, as we're talking about Spanish and independence of South America? Who were the Peninsulares? Again, think of the peninsula of Iberia. Who were the Criollas? Those would be equivalent to like the Americans born in the American colonies that were still English. They thought of themselves as English, but they were born in the New World. Mestizos, so those who married native peoples. The Caudillos,